Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the Skyscraper Museum, and I welcome you tonight to the continuing series of book talks, of author talks that we do. And tonight we're in webinar format only, rather than being in the gallery as we have for the last few evenings. Although I'm in the gallery of the World Trade Center section of the museum, which seems highly relevant to tonight's topic on the Great Miscalculation, the race to save New York City's Citicorp Tower, because in the decades before our later tragedy of 9/11, there was a threatened collapse that involved some of the same cast of characters in terms of the engineer the engineering review, Les Robertson. And I'm going to share a few slides with you as I do the introductions for our speakers tonight. The title of the book and our author, Michael Greenburg, I will introduce in more fully in a moment. But here is the cover of the book that contains the shooting perspective up the side of the sheer Citicorp Tower, which is in order to contextualize a little bit in the kind of world of skyscraper design and engineering in the late 1960s and coming into the 1970s, coming out of this, or upon the heels of this period of the creation and invention, really, of super tall towers, like with the World Trade Center and the Sears Tower, both conceived in the 1960s and then completed in the early 1970s, when the Citicorp building then became the next generation of 70s towers, even as Michael will explains in his book, in the context of economic crisis, but in coming out of the great boom years of especially heroic engineering. And I show you the World Trade Center towers here because one of the characters in Michael's book is Leslie Robertson. And we always like at every opportunity to remember Les, who was a board member, in fact, of the Skyscraper Museum, and a dear friend who passed away about 3 years ago now. So here was Les in the early 2000s in his office, which I visited often to see him and his work. But he also plays a role in the Citicorp design, or in the analysis of its design, because the engineer, as Michael Greenburg will tell us, was William LeMessurier, the architect Hugh Stubbins. And I wanted to show you, we're all, as New Yorkers, familiar with Citicorp and its sloped shape. I wanted to show you some of the contemporary towers of skyscraper design, because Michael himself is not an architecture historian. I'm taking on my role as filling in the background to talk about how design was changing in these years. And if we look at the Pennzoil Plaza designs of Philip Johnson from the early 1970s, you can see the continuing tradition of a severe modernism, but with an inclination towards formalism that one doesn't see in, for example, the Seagram building or Lever House or One Chase Manhattan Plaza. So the Mies, the SOM buildings that were prismatic, rectangular forms. Now, this interest in making new shapes, but still in the sheer surfaces and the strict lines, and the kind of asceticism that you see in the materials is something that's still characteristic, a continuation of the 1960s and into the 1970s. But it's also that heroic engineering that we want to talk about, that is one sees in the 60s and in the World Trade Center, and one sees, I think, pretty clearly in the Citicorp too, with standing on its four legs, which is what ultimately made it vulnerable for the story that Michael Greenburg is going to tell. Just to show one more building and by Philip Johnson, and the slides that that prevision the next decade in the 1980s of skyscraper design. You see in just a few years after Citicorp is finished, how dramatically design and architectural discourse deflects or pivots towards postmodernism, so that the interest in an interesting top, like the sloping top of Citicorp building, takes on a historicist reference, a stone rather than a shiny and reflective surface that becomes quite characteristic from the late 1960s and into the late 1970s and into the 1980s. So with that rather breathless history as background, I want to introduce Michael Greenburg, who is an author of he's a lawyer by profession, but also equally a professional writer. He has authored a number of books of a wide variety that usually have some kind of legal hook, but also a hook of scandal. In order to give you the breadth of some of the titles, I'll read them off here. One is a more recent one, The Noblewoman, Murdered a Minor, and Her Flight to Establish the School for African American Girls in the Slaveholding South. But before that, in a completely different century, the court-martial of Paul Revere's Sons of Liberty and a Forgotten Military Disaster. The Mad Bomber of New York, The Extraordinary True Story of the Manhunt That Paralyzed a City, and Peaches and Daddy, the story of a roaring 20s and the birth of a tabloid media. So you can see how wide his interests are, and you can see how he always finds a storyline to explore that has a certain amount of fascination and titillation to it. So Michael will take over in a moment, and I'll advance his slides and tell that story. But when Michael finishes talking about his book, he's going to be joined by another board member of the Skyscraper Museum, Najib Abboud, who is a structural engineer, who is an expert in practices, especially in forensic engineering and issues about collapse. Indeed, he worked on the structural analysis report for NIST of the World Trade Center collapse. And Najib is a younger generation than the engineers that Michael is going to be telling us about tonight. But he has a particular perspective, having been schooled during those years and then himself writing about the changes in the profession and professional ethics. So let me invite Michael to come onto the screen now, and I'll get off. And when Michael is finished, then Najib will join, and we'll stop to share, and you two will converse together, and I'll stay off the screen unless it becomes absolutely urgent for me to enter. So let me turn off my video.
Good evening, everybody. In the quiet of his Sebago Lake summer retreat, William LeMessurier soberly contemplates suicide. The structural engineer has performed a meticulous, floor-by-floor, brace-by-brace analysis of the Manhattan skyscraper that bears his signature design, a design that he now believes is gravely flawed. His focus centers on the 30th story, where he suspects the bracing joints are most vulnerable to extreme winds. If those joints fail, so too will the rest of the tower. He nervously calculates the probability of the storm in New York strong enough to cause the bolts holding the 30th floor joints to stress to point of fracture. Through careful examination of weather records, he determines to his dismay that a 16-year storm could cause a catastrophic failure, a 1 in 16 chance. Staring blankly out the window of his island home and grimly aware that the Atlantic hurricane season is fast approaching, LeMessurier considers the prospect of professional disgrace, financial ruin, and the horror of a building collapse in the heart of New York City. Again, I want to thank the Skyscraper Museum for inviting me this evening and for allowing me to share with you this fascinating story about genius and failure and morality. Next slide. Any discussion of the Citicorp Tower necessarily begins, ironically enough, with an old and crumbling Gothic church at the corner of East 55th and Lexington. In the late 1960s, St. Peter's Lutheran Church, led by its shrewd and forward-thinking pastor, Ralph Peterson, found itself with a dwindling congregation and a deteriorating building. When he learned that a real estate brokerage firm had begun assemblage of the city block for an undisclosed project and for an undisclosed client, he immediately recognized that the value of the church property was about to skyrocket. Despite numerous overtures to sell the property and move on, Peterson had held fast to his urban vision for St. Peter's. In time, he learned that Citibank, as it had come to be known, and its parent company, First National City Corporation, or Citicorp, had plans for a massive development on the block featuring a new high-rise office building. Well, Peterson insisted that St. Peter's was not going to move and that any new development plans on the block must accommodate the church in its present location. Well, after a lengthy and painstaking negotiation that lasted years, it was finally agreed that the old Gothic building would be demolished, and in its place, a new and structurally distinct church would be constructed on the same spot. Since St. Peter's real estate clout was equal to its moral clout, wrote the New York Times, a little arm twisting might have been involved. In keeping with Peterson's vision of an architecturally independent building, physically separate from the skyscraper, it was stipulated that the airspace above 2/3 of the footprint of the new church would remain open and that no element of the bank's new tower would encroach upon or interfere with the church building below. Unambiguous and seemingly innocuous, this requirement would nonetheless set into motion an engineering predicament with catastrophic implications. Next slide, please. With these basic site constraints in place, development of the Citicorp Center design phase began. From the outset, the architect chosen by the bank, Hugh Stubbins from Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrestled with the required location of the church as it affected the design of the skyscraper. Placement of the bank's building on the site with both columns conventionally placed at its, with bottom columns, conventionally placed at its four corners would necessarily result in one column drilling right through the sanctuary of the new church, a result obviously prohibited by the bank's agreement with Pastor Peterson. Well, knowing that the dilemma would require some skilled and creative engineering, Stubbins enlisted the assistance of his friend and colleague, William LeMessurier, a structural engineer also of Cambridge, who he had worked with on many other design projects in the past. Well, discussing the details of the Citicorp project over lunch one afternoon, the two men considered various possibilities, but ultimately decided that a cantilever of one corner of the building over the church could resolve the problem. To accomplish this, they recognized that the bottom support columns of the skyscraper would have to be massive and multiple stories in height. And more importantly, they would have to be placed at the outside center of each wall rather than at the corners. Clearly a precarious and daring proposition. Next slide. Well, LeMessurier considered these design parameters and began devising in his mind a rudimentary bracing system for the tower, consisting of a series of structurally independent V-shaped chevrons, each 8 stories in height and intersected by mass columns, vertically extending the full length of each side of the proposed tower to the base. He famously drew his concept on a napkin as he lunched with Stubbins. Next slide. Through this distinctive use of supermodules, he insisted that wind and gravity loads could be gathered in increments and guided down via diagonal compression through the base truss and distributed to the main columns below. To this unique and lightweight design, LeMessurier incorporated a first-of-its-kind tuned mass damper at the top of the tower, a 29-foot square, 8-foot thick, 400-ton yellow block of concrete set on a thin bed of oil designed to shift in counterbalance to the sway of the building. The damper was intended only for the comfort of building occupants and not for the structural safety of the tower. So with this complex engineering system agreed to, designed, and tested, construction of the tower began and progressed without incident. Upon its completion, the Citicorp Center was met with almost universal praise by the critics, and it became a catalyst for LeMessurier's career. Next slide. On October 12, 1977, at the dedication of the Citicorp Center, with Governor Hugh Carey and Mayor Abraham Beame in attendance, Hugh Stubbins called his creation a skyscraper for the people. Well, the Citicorp Tower was perhaps LeMessurier's crowning achievement. His novel wind bracing system and innovative application of damping technology earned him international acclaim. And in February of 1978, he was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering, one of the highest honors bestowed in the profession. Next slide. In the fall of 1977, a few months after dedication of the Citicorp Tower, a Princeton University undergraduate student by the name of Diane Hartley began work on her senior thesis. Under the direction of her supervisor, Professor David Billington, Hartley undertook a detailed study of the scientific, social, and symbolic meanings of the new Citicorp Center in New York City. The final thesis included a detailed history, not only of Citicorp Center, but of skyscrapers as an American institution. It encompassed 460 pages with 440 endnotes, 96 detailed plates, and 29 mostly hand-drawn technical figures in 2 leather-bound volumes. It was an extraordinary document. Next slide. As part of her work, Hartley had reached out to LeMessurier's office in Cambridge, who directed her to their engineering team in New York City. LeMessurier's New York engineers spoke openly with Hartley about the engineering of the tower and happily shared with her copies of the plans and calculations upon which its construction was based. By mid-March, with the deadline for her thesis already extended, Hartley turned to the final critical phase of her analysis, testing the wind resistance of the Citicorp Tower. Her approach was methodical. She broke down the expected design stresses of the building and compared them to the actual calculations provided by LeMessurier's engineers. Well, at the time, New York City's building code did not explicitly require engineers to consider non-perpendicular winds in high-rise construction. Indeed, LeMessurier himself later wrote that wind from diagonal angles wasn't widely discussed in engineering literature or in the classroom. But even as an undergraduate, Hartley intuited otherwise. In her thesis, she wrote, "The situation of a quartering wind must be examined in addition to that of wind striking full face." Next slide. Now, what exactly is a quartering wind? It's a wind that strikes the corner of a building at a 45-degree angle, thus impacting 2 sides at once rather than one. Unlike a straight-on wind that presses against a single face, a quartering wind spreads its force against multiple surfaces, creating a very different and potentially more dangerous load on the structure. Hartley ran the numbers. Using basic geometry, she calculated that while the force on any single face of the building in a quartering wind was only about 71% of that from a straight-on wind, the total wind load actually doubled because 2 sides were affected. The result being that the building would experience 42% higher stresses in quartering winds than in perpendicular winds. Well, this was a critical finding. She pored over the structural drawings and calculations, expecting to see some confirmation that the engineers had accounted for this effect, but she found nothing. No analysis of quartering winds. She adjusted for their impact on the building's unique column structure. Instead, the official static wind stress calculation showed numbers significantly lower than what she expected. Were these preliminary figures, she asked herself? Had the real calculations been done later? Well, she was down to the last 2 pages of her thesis and she needed answers. So she went back to LeMessurier's New York engineers. What am I doing wrong, she asked. Why don't my numbers match? She hesitated even making the call. LeMessurier's office was world-renowned, respected across the field of engineering. The Citicorp tower was standing tall, praised, admired, an architectural marvel. And here she was, just a student with no real experience, no credibility. Surely there had to be an explanation for the discrepancy. What concerned her most was the odd placement of the building's main columns and their potential vulnerability to quartering winds. Well, the engineer calmly explained that she had nothing to worry about. Far from being a weakness, he told her, the tower's column placement actually made it more resilient in quartering winds. Unlike a building with columns conventionally placed at the corners, he said, Citicorp's columns set in from the edges meant 2 legs were working in tension and 2 in compression, creating a more balanced and efficient system for resisting those diagonal wind forces. Yes, he acknowledged, quartering winds do increase the load, but because of the tower's unique design, that load was better distributed. It simply wasn't a critical factor in evaluating this building's structural integrity. Well, Hartley was a bit perplexed, but also very relieved. She just wanted to finish her thesis, graduate, and move on with her life. So she accepted the engineer's explanation without argument. But even after submitting her work, she couldn't shake a troubling thought. Yes, she had been assured that Citicorp's mid-face columns worked together to resist quartering winds, but she was concerned that because of their placement closer to the building's overturning axis, those columns didn't have the same mechanical advantage as ones positioned at the corners. To provide the same level of resistance, she believed, they would have needed to be much stronger than they actually were. Well, as it turned out, Hartley was right to this degree. Quartering winds did create a more variable stress level on parts of the tower than perpendicular winds. And while the Citicorp engineering team did consider those winds on the bottom columns, they had failed to fully analyze their impact on every structural component of the building. So although the engineers had overlooked key wind forces, the placement and strength of the columns themselves was not the real problem. But unbeknownst to Hartley, to LeMessurier, or to anyone else at the time, the building still harbored a hidden design flaw, a subtle, overlooked feature that under the right conditions could cause wind forces to amplify in a way that no one had predicted. Now, ironically, at about the same time that Hartley was placing the finishing touches on her thesis, another student telephoned LeMessurier's Cambridge office and asked to speak with the engineer. Now, LeMessurier was an educator, and though he was in the middle of a meeting at the time, he agreed to take the call. The student explained that he was a freshman architectural student in New Jersey and that his professor had assigned him a paper on the Citicorp tower. The bottom columns, the student told LeMessurier, were, according to his professor, in the wrong place. Well, LeMessurier took great pleasure in describing the unique field conditions presented by St. Peter's Church that required the mid-face placement of the columns. And he explained that in a quartering wind, these columns actually performed more efficiently than had they been placed at the corners. Only years later did the caller, who was named Lee DeCarolis, learn about the Citicorp engineering crisis and conclude that he was the student who may have set into motion LeMessurier's later discovery. It is reasonable to conclude, however, that both Hartley and DeCarolis contributed in some way to what would happen next. Well, in the coming days, LeMessurier decided that the placement of the Citicorp Tower columns and the design of his unique chevron bracing system would make for a wonderful lecture topic for his engineering class at Harvard, and he began making some notes and calculations about the topic. He later stated that this was prompted by a call from an architectural or engineering student in New Jersey, but never identified who that student was. Well, as LeMessurier began preparing his class notes, something nagged at him. A month earlier, while consulting on the plans for 2 new skyscrapers in Pittsburgh, he had learned that the member joints for the chevron bracing system on the Citicorp Tower had been secured with heavy bolts rather than the stronger but more expensive welding process originally incorporated into the building plans, a change approved by his firm. By itself, this was not an unusual or concerning modification. It was a more cost-efficient option and, if properly engineered, completely appropriate. Next slide. As LeMessurier dug deeper into his calculations, however, he discovered what he later called some very peculiar behavior in his wind bracing system. He learned that inherent in the design of the chevrons, the stresses in 4 of the 8 bracing members in each module vanished to 0 in a quartering wind, but at the same time, they increased by 40% in the remaining 4. LeMessurier knew that if the overall chevron bracing system was reactive to quartering winds, so too must be the splices that held that system together. He also knew that had the original specifications not been changed from full penetration welds for those splices, the bracing system would have provided more than ample resistance to winds from any direction. But with that change, the strength and capacity of the bolts that secured the connections instantly became a matter of unease, because he was certain that his engineers had not considered quartering winds in the design of those bolts. He insisted that New York code only required consideration of perpendicular winds, and that analysis of diagonal winds was simply not part of the custom and practice of high-rise building design at the time. Though not yet in a panic, LeMessurier immediately went down to his New York office and reviewed all the shop drawings and calculations for the Citicorp bracing system. He quickly confirmed that indeed quartering winds were not taken into consideration in the engineering of the bracing system splices, but he also learned to his dismay that instead of deducting only 75% of the actual gravity load in the building to offset wind tension, as was the standard to preserve factors of safety, his team had deducted the full compression, 100%. In so doing, the engineers concluded that only 4 bolts per splice were required. Now, if the effect of a quartering wind is considered, the wind stresses will increase by 40%. That being the case, LeMessurier calculated instead of 4 bolts, more than 10 bolts would have been required per splice. And had his team properly deducted only 75% of the gravity load to offset quartering wind tension rather than 100%, 14 bolts would have been needed. This thing is in real trouble, he began to think. Well, at that point, LeMessurier traveled to Ontario, Canada, to meet with his wind tunnel experts to obtain up-to-date weather statistics and to reanalyze the Citicorp Tower based on the effect of quartering winds on the bolted bracing system. He took the raw data back to his island home in Maine and spent the weekend immersed in calculations and probabilities. To his dismay, he now concluded that his building could in fact collapse in a storm that could strike New York City once every 16 years. The reality of a cataclysmic structural failure began to possess him. LeMessurier was now faced with an impossible decision. remain silent and pray that the building could withstand a destructive storm, or endure the risk of professional disgrace, humiliation, and the legal consequences of disclosure. Both seemed unthinkable, and each forced him into a corner. Suicide actually did cross his mind. To be sure, that would have ended his present anxiety, but he had a family and a legacy that weighed on his mind. By the end of the weekend, his thoughts cleared, and his only viable choice emerged. He would disclose his findings and face whatever consequences befell him. LeMessurier quickly notified his insurance company of the potential claim, and within 24 hours, he was in a New York conference room full of insurance defense lawyers explaining the situation and feeling the cool eyes of evaluation upon him. The Citicorp tower was observably sound and of worldwide architectural claim. They thought I was nutty, he recalled. Nobody in his right mind calls up and says, my building is going to fall down, he said. He nervously told the gathering, it doesn't take more than 10 minutes to realize that this is a disaster. And he explained the details of the inherent flaw in his bracing system. He admitted that his office had failed to consider non-perpendicular winds in the design of the splicing bolts. The result, he told them, was a series of vastly overstressed bracing connections in the building. The Citicorp tower, he told them, was in great danger. He then reminded the men that hurricane season was fast approaching. Next slide. Well, to independently evaluate LeMessurier's concerns, the insurance company called in an independent structural engineer by the name of Leslie Robertson, who you've been introduced to. Famously known for his design of the Twin Towers in New York's World Trade Center, Robertson immediately and unequivocally confirmed to the group that given the findings presented, they were, in all probability, facing the imminent prospect of total collapse of the tower in severe winds. So the next step, of course, was to notify the bank that its $193 million investment was in imminent and grave danger. Next slide. Walter Wriston, the chairman of Citicorp, accepted the news calmly and began thinking about the public relations aspects of what would happen next. LeMessurier had already developed a solution to the problem. A series of carefully engineered steel plates could be welded to both sides of each bolted connection like a splint to secure and reinforce the joints. He had created a detailed risk analysis of the tower and generated a priority schematic for the order of repairs to be conducted, with the sober understanding that if one of the bolted connections failed, so too would the others, with a calamitous result. In the coming weeks, LeMessurier shuttled back and forth to New York and conducted meeting after meeting. He worked with his New York engineering team and a steel fabricator to accurately design the steel plates for the tower's reinforcement. He set up a war room of sorts in Frank Sinatra's suite at the Waldorf Astoria while Sinatra was on tour. On a daily basis, he counseled with lawyers, bank representatives, engineers, experts, and specialists. Robertson insisted that local and state authorities be notified of the problem and the remedial work that was to ensue, and meetings with those officials also took place as required. A specialized firm from California was called in to wire the building with sensors to provide an advanced warning system in the case of untoward movement or instability. They had the tuned mass damper fine-tuned well beyond its original specifications to accommodate as much as possible dangerous building sway, and they added an emergency backup generator to be activated in the event of power loss. Weather forecasters were hired to provide hourly tracking of adverse weather events along the East Coast, and the engineers were given personal beepers to alert them of any and all untoward movement of the tower. Well, by all accounts, the engineers, technicians, bank officers, and bureaucrats worked side by side in a resolute and single-minded spirit of cooperation. To LeMessurier's chagrin, however, an emergency evacuation plan was developed by the bank with Les Robertson's assistance to be implemented by the Red Cross and local authorities that would, if activated, displace thousands of occupants, patrons, and neighbors from the area and provide aid and shelter as required. It was the step that LeMessurier feared would end his career. It was agreed that the remedial work was to be conducted during the evening hours in order to minimize disruption to the tenants in the building. Total secrecy was obviously impossible, but everyone involved did their best to downplay what was clearly a dangerous situation. A guarded and carefully calibrated public statement created and approved by Walter Wriston and the engineering team claimed that the purpose of the work was to strengthen the building as a matter of prudence in light of some new weather statistics rather than necessity. The objective was to reinforce the building as secretly as possible without panic or concern about the safety of the structure. LeMessurier later said, "We had to cook up a line of bull, and white lies at this point are entirely moral." Well, even as work began under the cover of darkness, inquisitive reporters began asking questions. The Citicorp press release seemed only to heighten the curiosity rather than to allay it. One evening, as welders' torches lit up various levels of the tower, LeMessurier returned to his hotel room and was informed that a reporter from the New York Times had called. Filled with dread, he vacillated on what to do. Just after 6 p.m., he picked up the phone and dialed the reporter's number at the Times. The call was answered by a recording stating that the New York Times had just gone on strike. In point of fact, and to LeMessurier's enormous relief, every major newspaper in New York had joined the pressmen's strike. It would last through October. LeMessurier later said, "If the papers hadn't been on strike, I dread to think what would have happened. It would have been pure hell." It was, he said, the greatest thing that ever happened. The work to save the Citicorp Tower continued throughout the entire summer of 1978, in the dead of night, in the absence of the watchful eyes of the New York press. With each corrective well, the building was strengthened, and as summer progressed, LeMessurier began to breathe somewhat easier. And then the weather changed. Next slide. On August 28th, satellite imagery showed a cyclonic turning of low cloud elements about 480 nautical miles southeast of Bermuda. 36 hours later, it was no longer just a system. It was a tropical depression, and it was headed west-northwest. When word of the storm reached the engineers, the team ramped up into full disaster readiness. Labor Day weekend was approaching, and the city was humming. By 6:30 a.m. on August 30th, the engineering team had already assembled at the Waldorf Command Center. They were deep into evaluating possible evacuation scenarios. Welding work was still underway. As LeMessurier admitted, we weren't quite ready. That evening, the storm was given a name, Tropical Storm Ella, the fifth named storm of the 1978 hurricane season. By 9 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a warning in all caps. Satellite pictures indicate Ella is continuing to strengthen and could be a hurricane within 24 hours. They weren't wrong. Flight reconnaissance confirmed it. Ship reports echoed it. By the night of August 31st, Ella had become a hurricane heading toward the east, the coast of North Carolina. LeMessurier wasn't waiting to see if it would turn north toward New York. That possibility was obvious and terrifying. His jaw was throbbing. He was suffering with an impacted molar, aggravated by the ongoing stress. But the meetings had to go on. He sat with his team and with executives from the bank, evaluated the building's readiness. The question on everyone's mind, could the tower survive a direct hit from Ella? If the tuned mass damper performed as enhanced, and LeMessurier believed it would, the tower could withstand a 200-year storm at that moment. What kept him awake was a storm entering through the Narrows, its eye just west of Manhattan, hurling southeast winds directly at the tower. Ella, he feared, could be that storm. By Friday afternoon, September 1, LeMessurier had canceled his plans to spend the holiday weekend in Maine. By 4:50 p.m., the storm was packing winds over 125 miles per hour, and barometric pressure had dropped to 959 millibars. Robertson's private meteorologist updated the engineers nearly every hour. As Ella roared toward the Outer Banks, it began to track northward, up the East Coast and toward New York. Everyone was sweating blood, LeMessurier later said. But then, on Saturday, September 2nd, a ridge of high pressure settled over the Northeast, swiftly veering Ella north and away from the coast. It would go on to slam the Canadian Maritimes with winds of 140 miles per hour, the strongest storm to ever hit those waters. Next slide. Well, by the end of the summer, work on the tower was complete. LeMessurier insisted that it could now withstand a 1 in 1,000 year storm, as strong and impervious as any high-rise building in the world. For the next several years, legal acrimony ensued between Citicorp and LeMessurier, but court action was ultimately avoided with a carefully and personally negotiated settlement about equal to the available liability insurance coverage. As Joe Morgenstern wrote in his 1995 New Yorker piece about the Citicorp drama, the crisis produced heroes, but no villains. William LeMessurier's actions are remembered not only for his innovative and cerebral approaches under unspeakable stress, but also as a refreshing example of professional ethics and integrity in the engineering industry and beyond. He did have his detractors. After all, he had failed to properly oversee the engineering details of his building during its design, leaving all of that to his New York team. And he had engaged in a conspiracy of secrecy as to the real reasons for the corrective work. Wouldn't you have wanted to know the truth before you entered that building in 1978? Today, 601 Lexington Avenue still stands as a silent testament to an engineer's courage and a lesson to all of us about the power of integrity. We live in a world built on invisible trust, bridges, buildings, planes. This story reminds us how fragile that trust can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So Najib, I will not come on. Why don't you are now the respondent and Q&A leader, and why don't you engage in discussion?
Thank you, Carol. Michael, fascinating storytelling. So thank you for that. I'm a little bit struck by the differences in tone between that era and the actors of that era versus what I'd expect a little bit today. It seems to be very much a story of personalities, of stars, very much present in the story. It's a mention of specific individuals rather than firms. Is that kind of specific to LeMessurier's Leslie Robertson, or is that your understanding of that era and the profession at that time?
So Najib, thank you, by the way, for your kind words. I think it's a little bit of both. Actually, I think, and the story presents this dichotomy between heroism and hubris, and it's no secret that LeMessurier and Robertson, though they worked very well in this particular crisis, they did not agree on everything. They did not agree on every detail. Of course, there were times that they were at loggerheads. They had different personalities. Clearly, they had different work methods and strategies, and they, as I said, they didn't agree on every aspect of what to do. And I think LeMessurier, in particular, though he seemed to have put it away in favor of of what needed to be done. He was obviously concerned about, his personal standing, his personal position. What was this going to do to his career? And I'm not sure. Maybe you can address what, is that. I mean, we're human beings. Engineers are human beings with tremendous amount of stress and responsibility, but you are subject to human emotions and self-preservation.
It is, you actually nailed it on the head. I can give the counterexample, the Tacoma Narrows famous bridge that collapsed in the winds. Its design structural engineer's reputation was destroyed. And there is no story of redemption there, though you could argue it wasn't a personal mistake as much as science had not caught up to understand the what we call secondary effects of winds that happen at trailing edges. So your remarks are true. Today, we'd probably resort to what has the appearance of a more objective process, which is one of peer review. It is also mandated by codes in situations such as these where the structural system is complex and outside of the norm. So there is a degree of process and anonymity that you would hide behind. But at the end of the day, the profession is still very much one of personal responsibility. I imagine just like a surgeon, and the feelings are raw and the consequences are extremely severe either way. Yet the actors in the stories appear to have risen above the impetus of self-preservation. I would say even the corporate owners, at least initially, seem to have worked with them. A pleasant surprise, at least from an engineer's perspective, rather than starting by pointing the finger. So I find it distinctly different in tone than what I'd expect to see today. So that was really enlightening to me. And I really liked the way you summarized it. It is a story of genius, failure, and morality. And when I was in college, after that period, the Citicorp building is still being taught as a story of ethics, of doing the right thing, without all of the ups and downs that got you to that point. But it's literally doing the right thing as an imperative. And we don't have too many examples in real life to point to. This is what it means to do the right thing, right? So I thought it's the only kind of living story of doing the right thing in structural engineering that I can think of.
And to follow up on your point, Najib, I think all the parties, as you said, maybe surprisingly, the owners were surprisingly non-accusatory.
Right.
They worked to get at the point of crisis. They all worked together toward the common goal of saving the building. It wasn't always as soon as the crisis was over, the legal letters started flying, and a lot of LeMessurier's work on this crisis was encapsulated in a document that he prepared, not just to memorialize it, but it was a legal document. It was set up to set forth his defenses, how he would approach defending a lawsuit, because everybody believed there was going to be a lawsuit. To follow up on the good spirit of cooperation here. LeMessurier asked, when they began dialogue with the bank officers, LeMessurier asked, no lawyers. They asked, let's try to do this without the lawyers. And both sides agreed to do this. So LeMessurier personally negotiated this settlement.
Interesting.
The bank obviously put together its worst case scenario with every bit of potential damage and injury and out-of-pocket expense. LeMessurier was able to whittle it down. And by the time they settled, which was probably a year and a half later, I think, the emotions had cooled and they were able to do that effectively. But again, it just demonstrates this spirit of cooperation that ultimately, permeated the entire event.
Interesting. And just to geek for a second, the entire issue of quartering winds was not incorporated officially into codes until the 90s. So yes, there was an understanding among the best in the industry that you should think beyond the prescriptive nature of the code. It shows you the lag that we have between actually enacting and prescribing certain measures. And that's why complex projects tend to require these heroes, these stars, and these outsized scientists to actually weigh in and hopefully do the right thing. The last element that I wanted to highlight that you mentioned is the entire secrecy issue, which is a little bit of what today we would view as too much of a paternalistic attitude towards the public. And that probably, if it were to happen altogether again today, wouldn't quite happen that way, or we wouldn't think it is the right thing to do. Anybody rethought that matter? Did LeMessurier ever comment as to whether that was in doubt in his mind, whether it's the appropriate thing to do?
No. Everything that I read, he felt that it was absolutely the appropriate thing to do. And his comment during the crisis that white lies are entirely appropriate. I never saw anything that backed off that sentiment, but he wasn't alone. I mean, the bank had their own interest here. They were always thinking about public relations, even when the engineers came to them in the design phase and proposed a tuned mass damper, because the building was light, to minimize the sway, the movement of the building, and the bank officers were, well, I'm not sure that we really want to have word of this 400-ton slab of concrete at the top of our tower to prevent undue motion. So the bank had their own agenda here. So and they certainly, when they structured that public statement, again, they wanted to minimize it and make it a matter of prudence rather than necessity, because that served their needs as well. It served LeMessurier's need. I think, frankly, the only objective actor here was Les Robertson.
And my understanding is that the mayor was also an advocate of that secrecy. He was a proponent of it, looking back at that period. It's a very enlightening story. We will continue to teach it in its best spirit, I think. So I've written a chapter on forensic engineering. It is one of the examples that we give. And I think it will forever remain an inspiring story in terms of doing the right thing, even if getting there had a little bit of its ups and downs. So thank you very much, Michael. A very interesting presentation, a very interesting book.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
But let me chime in maybe with one last question, just as we conclude our hour. It's not often that engineers get credit, although they get the blame when things are on the on the verge of going wrong, or indeed have gone wrong. And so I wanted to mention, in part in context of the exhibition that we have up now on the modern concrete skyscraper at the museum, where we look in the post-war period in the 1960s at the role of concrete, especially, and we focus on the material. But one of the figures that emerges in that period as a great genius is Fazlur Khan, working at SOM as a partner and inventing the tube approach to structure. And it's in the 1960s in particular that architecture and engineering, whether it's in a single firm like SOM, which is pretty extraordinary, or marrying an architectural firm with an engineering firm, as Thornton Tomasetti is so often brought in order to design and realize the structural design. But there's been very little discussion of Hugh Stubbins in this story. Now we're focusing on the engineering, but it's the role of structural engineers remains very hidden for most of history, really, of modern architecture, unless there is some kind of extraordinary pairing or unification in one figure. And so, Michael, you didn't tell very much about Stubbins and how he figured after the fact, after the realization. Is there a story there or not?
To my research, after dedication of the building, and during the crisis, Stubbins was kind of along for the ride. He was the first person that LeMessurier attempted to contact when he learned of the problem. In reality, Stubbins was traveling, and he was only able to reach Stubbins' lawyer, and that lawyer hesitatingly met with LeMessurier and guided him to the insurance companies. But he was. Look, Stubbins was involved in the meetings, and if I'm not mistaken, his insurance policy was also involved in the settlement. So I think everybody, without claiming any legal responsibility, they set up their usual defenses, and ultimately, the insurance companies came in. But no, Stubbins did state, as well as his associate Easley Hammer, that it was worse than they could possibly imagine. Hamner said it was the worst thing that ever happened in his professional career. So they went through the pain. But there wasn't a great deal that they could do. There was the engineers, they all had New York partners, and the engineers, were saddled with this. They kind of created the problem. They needed to resolve it.
Well, thank you for bringing us this story that brings engineers into the fore, especially when it helps to reveal how difficult their job is, and how their professional response needs to be at the highest level of responsibility, as it is with Najib. And we thank you for bringing your expertise and your perspective to this discussion tonight, too. So thank you both, and thanks everybody for joining us. And we hope we'll see you next time in the month of July. We will be looking with Thomas Campanella at planners and and at a big scale of engineering the landscape. So check our website for that date later in July, and we'll hope to see you then. So thanks, Michael. Thanks, Najib. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.